Get on it.
Well, Sonny Jims, it's that time of the year again where we go back and look at all the first-person games that we were blessed with throughout the past 12 months. This retrospective is expanded to the first-person genre on the whole, not just first-person shooters. And again, I feel I should mention that obviously I don't get to play every single first-person game that comes out. So if there's a game that I do not talk about, then chances are it's because I simply didn't have enough time to pick it up and review it. Also, this was kind of the year of the early access survival games, and if you've played one of these, you've played them all. On that note, I won't be talking about really any of those games like Stranded Deep, Savage Lands, or The Forest, which, would you believe it, is still in early access. You don't need a review to know what those games are all about. You chop down trees, you make campfires, and you eat food. There, I just reviewed every single early access survival game ever made. Anyway, now that we've cleared that up, grab some popcorn, grab a drink, and let's do this shit. So the first big game release of the year was Dying Light, developed by Techland, who worked on the Dead Island series, and Dying Light was little more than Dead Island with parkour. Featuring a protagonist who sounded like he was simply filling in for Troy Baker, it was a mostly boring story where you were dropped into a city overrun with zombies and carried out missions for a rebelling faction. Dying Light irritated me because it took the safe route of just pandering to the lowest common denominator by being yet another zombie game. It copied a lot of gameplay elements from other games like Far Cry 3 and Assassin's Creed, but mostly I was just irritated by the combat. Seeing weapons break and fall apart after being used 5 or 6 times just wasn't any fun, and the shooting was mediocre. Fighting other human enemies was also very tedious, and the progression of unlockable skills was preset, giving little to no room for actual customization. The only thing the game did right was the day and night cycle. At night time, the game was realistically dark and you came across far more dangerous zombie types. Across the city, you had safe houses that utilized UV lights as defense against the zombie horde. But this mechanic wasn't enough to save what I consider to be a largely uninspired title and not the best start to the year. Early in February, not too long after Dying Light, we got the release of Evolve, which had to be one of the most colossal flops of the year. Evolve is proof that a good concept doesn't carry a game. Thunder! In Evolve, you're playing as either a large alien or one of 4 hunters searching for the alien, and servers would rotate the role you played from match to match. As the hunters, you track the alien across large maps looking for signs of its passage, whilst the alien goes around eating the local fauna, evolving into more powerful stages, hopefully before it gets trapped and defeated by the combined efforts of the hunters. Evolve had a lot of polish visually, but the gameplay became boring very quickly, and even at its peak, the player base and community was very small. To top it all off, the game was jam-packed full of day one DLC, and I wouldn't be surprised if it holds some sort of award for the most amount of DLC of all time. It looked good, it sounded good, and it was made by the same people who created Left 4 Dead, but Evolve was ultimately forgettable. In March, I took a look at a game called Monstrum, a cool little first-person horror game where you search for spare parts to repair a helicopter, a life raft, or a submarine to escape a tanker in the middle of the ocean, whilst being hunted down by 3 different kinds of monsters. Monstrum came out of early access in May, and it ended up being an enjoyable horror game, reminding me a lot of Alien Isolation, where you hid in lockers and under beds to escape your nightmarish pursuers. The monster designs were unsettling, and the game made good use of sound effects to heighten the mood. Overall, a bit bare bones on content, but still a fun little game. The price is a little bit steep for the amount of content, so maybe wait until this one is on sale. That same month, we also got the next installment in the Five Nights at Freddy's series with Five Nights at Freddy's 3. This one takes place in a theme park with an attraction that recreates the original incident featured in the first game. You play as a security guard for the theme park, suffering from hallucinations of the original animatronics, as well as being hunted down by a new one called Springtrap. Expectedly set across 5 nights, it was that old chestnut of micromanaging a bunch of different parameters and hoping that the random events that occurred on each night didn't overlap to the point that you were subjected to one of the game's many arrogant jump scares. Whilst we're talking about Five Nights at Freddy's 3, it would be prudent to talk about Five Nights at Freddy's 4, which was released later in the year. Supposedly the final game in the series, this time you're playing as a kid trying to stop the animatronics from getting into his bedroom. You've got 2 doorways adjacent to the room to keep an eye on, the closet in front of you, as well as the bed behind you. It's really just more of the same, though you can run to the left and right door to check either hallway and also to the closet, which makes it feel a bit more interactive. But again, it's just a matter of coming to grips with the half dozen different mechanics, looking out for visual and audio cues, and hoping the RNG aspect of the game goes in your favour. If I can say one thing about these games though, it's that the price is right. I mean, for what you're getting with them, they're about as affordable as they're gonna be. And if you have a mate to play with, they can be very entertaining. In late March, we got a great game that I don't think anyone seemed to know about called Spirits of Xanadu, with influences from System Shock 2 and Ridley Scott's Alien. It was a sort of experimental first-person shooter where you play the part of an engineer repairing a derelict ship. You soon learn the inhabitants of the ship were overcome with a bizarre virus that caused them all to experience unsettling hallucinations, and as you uncover the details of their whereabouts, your character also begins to suffer from these adverse effects. It's one of the more interesting games I played in 2015, with the only downside to it being the shooting, which left the entire ship literally empty after you'd killed all of the sentry bots that patrolled the area. But I'd still recommend this game to anyone who is patient and can appreciate subtle storytelling and gameplay that doesn't hold your hand the entire time. Moving on to April, we've got a couple lesser known titles with Into the Gloom and Postal 2 Paradise Lost. Into the Gloom is a first-person puzzle-solving horror game with a pixel art style using only black, white, and red as its color palette. Your character's stuck in a nightmarish world running from a spooky-looking apparition as you complete a series of puzzles that will leave you with one of 5 possible endings. The whole thing is surprisingly frightening, relying on jump scares but also having a very unsettling and creepy atmosphere, with great use of sound and imagery to heighten the mood. I don't really know many people who've played this one, but if you see it on sale, give it a shot.
We rejoin our 2 heroes, the Postal Dude and his beloved sidekick Champ, as they narrowly escape the nuclear destruction of their apocalyptic weekend escapades.
Postal 2 Paradise Lost, on the other hand, is about as far removed from Into the Gloom as humanly possible. So if you've played Postal 2, you know what you're in for, but for the uninitiated, Postal 2 is about throwing the player into this large sandbox world, giving them a series of mundane objectives, but allowing them to carry out these objectives in the manner they choose. Almost every mission in the game ends in extreme violence, with various bodily fluids also heavily featured. Paradise Lost is a blatantly self-aware game that has numerous other video game references, as well as referencing the industry itself, taking a very humorous stab at Tim Schafer just as an example. Really the only thing that's got going against it is the technology. I mean, it runs on an old version of the Unreal 2 engine, and it really does feel like it, with bad hit detection, bad loading times, and performance. It's not a game for everyone, but if you haven't got a social justice stick rammed up your ass, it's very entertaining. Space Beast Terrafright was one of the first early access games I reviewed in 2015, developed by a team called Nornware AB. It's your standard indie, roguelike first-person shooter with procedurally generated levels and artificial difficulty. In this one, you're a space marine heading into a poorly lit space station to download information from data cores to access and overload the power reactor before escaping back to the airlock. When I first reviewed this game back in April, it had only one type of alien and the mechanics were a little bit simple. Currently the game now has a new alien type, 2 more weapons, and all of the turret guns around the space station now have limited ammo. Your heads up display also has a chance to run out of power, able to be fixed at repair stations. Space Beast Terrafright is admittedly a lot better than it was at the start of the year, but the placement of data cores is still a big issue to the game's fairness. Look, this game has potential, but it's still mired by some serious balancing issues that make the game unfairly difficult. I mean, something as simple as the muzzle flash and smoke emissions from weapons literally blocking your vision so you can't see what the hell is in front of you. I'd say keep your eye on this one though, because there is a good concept here, it just needs to spend a bit more time in the oven, so to speak. Lastly, in April we got Solar Ax, yet another System Shock 2 inspired sci-fi horror game featuring so-called open-ended stealth and combat options for the player. Again, you're some kind of space engineer dealing with a space virus as you navigate a space station and search for a means to escape. Upon release, Solar Ax was a horribly broken game with bad controls, bad stealth, bad visuals, bad performance, bad writing, just bad everything. The game said it was open-ended and offered the option of combat or stealth even though you rarely had any ammo for your weapons and the hit detection was so appalling you were better off not using them anyway. Part of what stung the most about Solar Ax was that you could see its potential. It really was a game that appeared to have a lot of love put into it. And apparently since its release, the development team have been adamantly working on fixing the game's issues. Well, so they've said, and yet I reinstalled it to see if that was the case, and I can tell you I had mixed results. The crouch speed when stealthing has been increased and the hit detection isn't as bad, but then I still saw things like this, and this, and this. After loading a checkpoint that caused me to fall through the map, I think that was all I needed to see. Shit be broken, son. In May, we got what is possibly my personal game of the year with Wolfenstein the Old Blood. I made the mistake of referring to this as DLC, but it's really its own standalone expansion. In something of a recreation of the original game, Wolfenstein 3D, and taking elements from Return to Castle Wolfenstein as well, the Old Blood is set before the events of the New Order, as you search for a dossier that contains important information on the series' antagonist, Deathhead. In the prologue, you're captured by the Nazis and sent to Castle Wolfenstein before escaping to a nearby village as an all-out zombie apocalypse occurs, and the game takes a total shift in tone. With the return of the ass-kicking BJ Blazkowicz, violent gameplay, great visuals and fantastic sound effects and music, the Old Blood was a whole heap of fun. The only thing I didn't enjoy about the Old Blood was some of the first few areas in the game where they force you into taking a stealth route, but after this the game is pretty much non-stop action all the way until the end. I never get sick of unloading those automatic shotguns into a Nazi's face at point blank range, or shooting the propane tank on the back of those armoured soldiers and watching them get blown to chunks. It's one of the best shooting games of 2015 and also one of the best shooting games in recent years, and I couldn't recommend this one more if someone had a gun to my head. Around this time was when the formerly free-to-play remake of Half-Life Black Mesa was also released on Steam as an early access title. Now, I originally reviewed the mod that was available on the website, which had turned out to be a lot different to the version on Steam. Having gone back to take a look at this game since May, I can honestly say that it is vastly improved. The shooting controls are polished a lot more, the timing of attacks for certain enemy types has been tweaked, and overall it's a much more well-rounded game. I would still suggest people go back and play the original Half-Life first, but Crowbar Collective are doing a great job with Black Mesa. And the fact that they've improved the game immensely since its inception as an early access title speaks volumes. Black Mesa is proof that not all early access games are a total waste of time. Rounding out May, we got Power Slave EX, which was a repackage of Power Slave, the first-person shooter originally released for the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn back in the 90s. This is a game with an interesting development cycle, most importantly because there were two versions of the game made, one for the PC and the other for consoles, and both of these are vastly different. On the PC it was little more than a Doom clone, but on the consoles the game featured a map system, various upgrades that gave you new abilities, and also multiple endings. I reckon this is easily one of the best shooters to be released on the Sega Saturn and the PlayStation, and this repackage made the game playable with a mouse and keyboard setup, just showing how well the game has aged. Unfortunately, Power Slave EX was taken down from its website for reasons I'm not entirely sure. There are still ways to get your hands on this game, but you didn't hear that from me. On the plus side, the same developer is also working on a remaster of Turok, expectedly called Turok EX, which should be out by the end of the month, so keep your eyes peeled for that one. Moving into June, we've got a title that you may not have known about, though in all honesty you didn't really miss much, and that title is Super Noah's Ark 3D. Something of a HD remaster of the original Wolfenstein 3D clone developed by Wisdom Tree, this new version made the game playable in high resolutions and allowed the game to be played with a modern keyboard and mouse control scheme. At its core, it's still the same game. You move around Noah's Ark shooting various animals with food pellets to put them back to sleep. Every half dozen levels and you're up against a tougher animal like a giraffe or a monkey, which serves as a boss fight. The main menu, heads-up display, items, enemies and weapons are all similar to those from Wolfenstein 3D. There is a bit of novelty with this one due to its subject matter, but if you don't play Super Noah's Ark 3D, it's not like the world is going to end. Gynophobia has to be a contender for one of the worst games I've ever played. If you've ever wondered what life is like for someone with a crippling fear of both spiders and women, then this is the game for you. Playing as the aforementioned Gynophobic, you're thrown into this weird nightmare that lasts all of 30 minutes where you're attacked by spiders and zombie women. You finally overcome your fears as you fight a half spider, half woman for the final boss, which I guess cures you of your condition. Then there's also a minigame where you escape a sewer full of zombies, then repair a van to escape a city, whilst being chased by a big monster looking guy with a hammer. I'm not really sure what the point of this game is, maybe it's supposed to make people aware of gynophobia as a condition. It is an actual real world medically diagnosed phobia after all. But all it really did was make me aware of horrible piece of shit indie games that serve no purpose. Not much really seemed to happen in the month of July, but there are a couple titles released on Steam that are worth mentioning at the very least, and these are Spooky's House of Jump Scares and Rake. Spooky's House of Jump Scares is a walking simulator where you move through 1,000 rooms of a creepy mansion, tormented by a cute looking ghost named Spooky. As you progress onward, the game becomes more and more sinister, introducing new creatures to attack you as the tone constantly shifts towards a darker, horror-like atmosphere. It's free to play, so there's not really much of a point to ripping the game apart. For what it is, it's an enjoyable little time waster, even if it has practically no depth, and panders to the standard crew of douchebag YouTubers, who pull retarded faces in video thumbnails, and have perfected the art of fake screaming. Rake, on the other hand, is definitely a lot more interesting. Based off the creepypasta of the same name, Rake has you playing as a guy camping out in the middle of the forest searching for the eponymous creature. You're supposed to plant cameras around the forest and set up bear traps and food to lure it into certain areas, but I found the easiest thing to do is just to go out running around and look for it directly. Rake is scary for all of 15 minutes until you figure out that the AI for the creature is absolutely brain dead. And if you've got enough ammo for your weapons, you can simply stand in one place and just let it come back to you for a regular dose of lead injection until you can easily finish it off. This game does have a neat concept, but it wasn't very well thought out, and the game mod just looks ugly and is horribly unoptimized to boot. I'll admit I've got a bit of a hard-on for Night Dive Studios. It might have something to do with the fact that they go around repackaging all of my favourite old school games, which, as I mentioned, is exactly what they did with System Shock Enhanced Edition. I think this is an important release because you don't quite often hear people talking about this game as much as they do the sequel, which is a shame because it's still a great sci-fi shooter that was mired more by the antiquated control scheme than the game itself. What this enhanced edition does is allow the game to be run at higher resolutions, but also include a mouse-look control scheme, improving the controls greatly and making it play like a modern first-person shooter. System Shock 1 has aged in a lot of ways, but it's still a very unique title with no hand-holding and an artistic and detailed game world to explore. Patient gamers should definitely check this one out, and it sure doesn't hurt that this enhanced edition runs flawlessly on modern operating systems. From the creators of Amnesia: The Dark Descent comes Soma, a sci-fi horror experience set deep in the Atlantic Ocean where your character wakes up a couple hundred years in the future. In essence, it's a stripped back version of the second Amnesia game with no inventory management, very basic puzzles, and a couple of moral decisions for the player to make that don't have any impact on the ending. Like most first-person horror games released in the last couple of years, all you can really do is hide from your attackers, and Soma uses a similar mechanic, where you're hunted by a bunch of different monsters throughout the campaign. Honestly though, I found Soma incredibly pretentious and kinda boring a lot of the time. The last few segments in the game, however, were incredible. These areas set on the deep ocean floor were real standouts. It'll only really take you 6 to 8 hours to get through it, and after that, there's very little reason to ever revisit it. A trap! The only real game worth mentioning in October was Warhammer End Times Vermintide. This is something of a Left 4 Dead clone set in the Warhammer universe where you can choose from one of 5 heroes and complete a series of missions against the plague-like race known as the Skaven. Vermintide had a few major issues. Firstly, the hit detection was pretty horrible and Skaven could clip through each other to essentially stack up on top of one another to hit the player. Acquiring loot was an incredibly tedious process where you'd only be rewarded with items if you successfully completed a mission, and even then there was no telling what you'd often get. The community wasn't fantastic either, and for a game centered around teamwork, it was all too common for your teammates to pretty much act like the other 3 players didn't exist. In its defense, yeah, I guess it would be better playing with people you know, but not everyone has that luxury. Vermintide isn't a total write-off though. I mean, the art style's appealing, the content is original, and the sound, voice acting, and visuals are a very high standard. It just needs a bit more work. As is always the case with pretty much every year, we got all the big guns in one month. In November, we saw the release of Call of Duty Black Ops 3, Fallout 4, and Star Wars Battlefront. In all fairness, Black Ops 3 isn't a bad game. In fact, across the board, it's a pretty solid experience. There's a polished single-player campaign and an extensive multiplayer mode on offer, as well as the zombies mode, which has become something of a staple of the series. The campaign did at least try to do a few things differently, kind of following on from Advanced Warfare. It centers around technology and a vision of what warfare looks like in the future. In Black Ops 3, this is envisioned as a world taking influences from Deus Ex, Ghost in the Shell, and I guess RoboCop, where soldiers are often more machine than man. Ultimately, this is a story about machines taking over, centering around a rogue AI program that has infected your allies with a virus that causes them to go batshit insane. Not the worst story, just kind of forgettable when it all finished, and also it lacked those multiple endings from the previous game. Aside from that, there's those expected multiplayer modes, which is what I think most people buy these games for anyway, and probably what most people are still investing their time in. I truly don't think you even need to review these games anymore, as most people's minds are already made up.
Because if my time in the army taught me one thing, it's that war never changes.
Fallout 4 saw the franchise return to the hands of Bethesda Softworks, who originally developed Fallout 3 and are known for the Elder Scrolls games Oblivion and Skyrim. Set in Boston, your character wakes up after being in cryostasis and sets out to search for his son. Forgetting all about this within the first 5 minutes of leaving the vault, as you get distracted by the multitude of things on offer. Now, Fallout 4 was in a lot of ways a casualized version of the previous games. The dialogue options were now stripped back to 4 responses, whereas before you could have had numerous choices. Weapon degradation was removed, and you didn't put points into different stats anymore. Instead, you just chose from perks and upgrades every time you leveled up, similar to what you'd see in any open world game. And it really was more of an open world game than a true RPG. I mean, the ending of the game literally gives you one of 2 options, regardless of the faction you side with. That doesn't mean it's bad, however, and there's a lot of stuff that the game did well. There was a much greater focus on power armor as an integral part of the game. Upgrading and maintaining the iconic armor was essential to exploring some of the more dangerous areas of Boston, and you also looked like a total badass inside it. Weapon and armor modification was extremely enjoyable and provided some of the better guns in the game, and the workshop mode for the settlements, where you can build and maintain little communities, was enjoyable even if it wasn't as robust as it could have been. Fallout 4 kind of fizzed out for me around the 50-hour mark, and in that time I saw all manner of bugs, glitches and errors. But I also got involved with tear-jerking quests, made my companion fall in love with me, became a veritable walking tank to my upgraded power armor, and had to make some tough decisions about who I thought should win the war for Boston. Playing Bethesda games, you often need to take the good with the bad, and Fallout 4 is a good example of that. Would I recommend it? Sure, it's not the RPG we may have been hoping for, but it does have a pretty high retention rate, and there's bound to be something in there that appeals to any gamer. Star Wars Battlefront was the last big release for November, and it had a bit of a lackluster response from gamers. As a reboot to the prior games, the content focused entirely on the original trilogy of films, ignoring all the horrible bullshit from the prequels. In all honesty, this isn't a bad game, but the problem is that it really is a stripped back version of the last couple of games, and it's undeniably bare bones on content. On the plus side, it looks and sounds fantastic and is utterly full of fan service. But the moment that wears off, you'll see a game with a little depth and a lot of repetition. I didn't have the best experience with this one also because I had a hell of a time finding a stable server to play on. Connection issues were common, and I would also get kicked out of matches for no apparent reason. In terms of the gameplay, there are balancing issues depending on whether or not you're playing as the Rebels or the Imperials, and also what type of map it might be on. But I guess what's really scariest about Battlefront is how it plays into this disturbing recent trend in gaming where developers release 50% of a game's content on launch, and then the other 50% through DLC and season passes. It's not going to make people want to buy season passes. If anything, it's going to make people hold off on purchasing games until all the planned content is available.
Scratch one Imperial fighter.
Anyway, before moving on to December, there's a few indie games I'll talk about real quickly, and these are One More Dungeon and Layers of Fear. One More Dungeon was your standard pixel art, roguelike, procedurally generated slog through a series of random levels as you kill the same 3 or 4 monster types over and over. This is a game with a cool concept, but I think it misunderstands what old school actually means, and there's very little depth to it, lacking a leveling up system, power-ups, or even all that much variety in the level design. It's more of an early access game than a full release, but I do think this could be a fun little game with a few more tweaks. Layers of Fear is another title that proves that not all early access games are a total waste of time. This one's pretty unique, where you're a has-been artist exploring a nightmarish vision of his home as you try to complete a painting that slowly alludes to some dark events that have taken place. Visually stunning with superb writing, fantastic scripted events, and a constantly shifting game world. Even in this largely unfinished state, there's a great game in the making here. I'd recommend that people hold off for the time being though, only to experience it in full when it's finally released, hopefully sooner rather than later. And finally in December we got Rainbow Six Siege, the first Rainbow Six game to see the light of day since Rainbow Six Vegas 2. Rainbow Six Siege focuses heavily around destructible environments, featuring maps with these cordoned off areas, but allowing you almost total freedom in how you're going to breach and enter with your teammates. Split up largely between two modes, Team Deathmatch and Terrorist Hunt, it's kinda hard not to enjoy yourself with this game, particularly during chaotic gunfights where the walls are exploding, bullets are whizzing around, and you're huddled in a corner as you're trying to fend off waves of terrorists, or the opposing team. Instead of player classes, you choose from one of 20 operators which have different speeds, armor ratings, and access to weapons and gadgets. The combination of operators chosen each match can make or break a game, and unlocking new operators and buggering around with them is what's really going to hold most people's attention. Overall, it looks good, it sounds good, the AI is smart, and it's fun to play. Though it is again one of those games that's a bit dry on content. I mean, it lacks a single player mode, and there's only a handful of maps on rotation, and as a result, I think this one's going to be dead pretty soon. Though whilst it does retain your interest, there's a good time to be had. And that brings us to the end of my 2015 first-person retrospective. In case you're wondering, my favourite non-FPS game of the year was the Resident Evil remaster. My favourite movie was Mad Max Fury Road, and my favourite sandwich was a Reuben. Let me again take this opportunity to thank everyone for their continued support on my channel. This time last year we were at 10,000 subscribers, now we're upwards of 30,000. I truly do appreciate everyone's support for my videos and the constructive criticism I receive, and as always you can reach me on YouTube, Steam or Twitter, and I always try to respond to genuine comments and questions. And as long as you guys keep enjoying the videos, I'll keep making them. So having said that, let me wish you all a Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year, and all that shit. I'll see you in 2016.